Australia's classification board has a bit of a reputation among gamers. A reputation for being a little strict. Over the years, it's become infamous for slapping bans on certain games, sometimes for reasons that feel downright absurd. From over-the-top violence to questionable drug references, even if it's just healing items, the board has drawn a hard line on what's deemed acceptable. So today, we're diving into the world of banned video games in Australia, a list that's equal parts fascinating and hilarious. If there's one game that feels tailor-made to upset censors, it's Postal 2. Released in 2003, this darkly comedic first-person shooter is infamous for its crude humor, gratuitous violence, and wildly offensive content. You play as the Postal Dude, navigating a week in the ironically chaotic town of Paradise, Arizona, where seemingly mundane errands like buying milk or returning a library book can spiral into absolute carnage, depending on how you approach them. When Postal 2 reached Australian shores, the classification board took one look and slammed down the ban hammer. The key issue? The game's ability to commit violent acts against innocent NPCs, particularly when combined with its unrestrained gore.
Would you please sign my petition?
Oh, and the inclusion of drug use as a gameplay mechanic didn't help either. Specifically, the game allows players to use substances like catnip to enhance abilities, a detail that the board flagged under its strict guidelines against incentivizing drug use. Despite, or perhaps because of, its notoriety, Postal 2 has remained a cult classic, and is one of my favorite games of all time. In July of 2024, Running with Scissors submitted an appeal, and the game was reclassified as MA 15+, allowing it to once again be sold down under. Grand Theft Auto 3 was a game changer when it hit shelves in 2001, ushering in the era of open world gaming as we know it. Set in Liberty City, players can roam freely, cause chaos, and engage in all kinds of morally questionable activities. But when it came to Australia, the classification board had some serious reservations. Initially, GTA 3 was allowed into the country with an MA 15+ rating, but that didn't last long. Shortly after its release, the board revisited the game and decided to revoke its classification. The board cited the inclusion of explicit sexual content, particularly the ability to pick up sex workers, combined with the game's violent themes. This reclassification came after public outcry about the game's content and its potential influence. Rockstar didn't let the ban stop them though. They quickly released a modified version of the game in Australia, removing the offending content to secure a new MA 15+ rating. The re-release version went on to sell well, but the incident cemented GTA 3 as one of the most controversial games in Australian gaming history. GTA 3 might have had some hiccups during the classification process, but Manhunt took things to a whole new level. Released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, this stealth-based horror game had players stepping into the shoes of James Earl Cash, a death row inmate forced to participate in a series of brutal snuff films orchestrated by a sadistic director. The game is dark, gritty, and unapologetically violent, with an emphasis on executing enemies in increasingly gruesome ways. Check out my video on Manhunt if you haven't already. Originally being released with an MA 15+ rating, the board reconsidered following the infamous Manhunt murder. The game was banned outright for its extreme violence, with the board citing its demeaning depictions of violence and the way it seemed to reward players for committing horrific acts. To make matters worse, the atmosphere of the game, bleak and unrelenting, only amplified its unsettling nature, which didn't sit well with the country's already strict standards. Manhunt quickly gained a cult following because of how taboo it felt. For players, it was a uniquely twisted experience. For Australia, it was a prime example of what happens when a game goes too far. When Fallout 3 launched in 2008, it brought players into a massive, post-apocalyptic wasteland full of radiation, super mutants, and tough moral choices. But while gamers around the world were busy scavenging and shooting their way through the capital wasteland, Australian players hit a snag. The game was initially refused classification. Fallout 3 included a variety of in-game drugs like morphine that provided gameplay benefits. The Australian Classification Board took issue with how these fictional substances mimicked real-life drug use, claiming it could promote or encourage drug abuse. It wasn't the violence or the grim setting that raised eyebrows, it was the idea of shooting up for a stat boost. To get the game past the censors, Bethesda reworked the drug system, renaming morphine to Med-X for everyone, not just Australia. Once the changes were made, Fallout 3 was approved for release. It's a funny story in hindsight considering how much chaos the game lets you unleash otherwise. You can nuke a town off the map, but morphine, that's where the classification board drew the line. When Hotline Miami burst onto the indie scene in 2012, it quickly became a cult hit thanks to its brutal gameplay, neon-soaked visuals, and a pulsating synthwave soundtrack. The game follows a masked, nameless protagonist carrying out a series of ultra-violent missions, blending fast-paced action with a cryptic, surreal narrative. The game was refused classification in Australia due to a particular scene involving sexual violence during the cutscene. While the developers argued that the sequence was intended as a commentary, and even included an option to skip it, the classification board maintained that it violated their strict guidelines around sexual violence in media. Interestingly, the sequel, Hotline Miami 2, faced an even harsher ban for similar reasons, but this time the developers had a unique response. When an Australian fan asked how they could play the sequel legally, one of the creators reportedly said, "Just pirate it." Marc Ecko's Getting Up, Contents Under Pressure, is one of those games that blends urban culture, rebellion, and a touch of controversy. Released in 2006, it puts players in the shoes of a young graffiti artist named Train, who navigates the city's underground art scene while avoiding the law and rival taggers. The game's focus on street art, specifically illegal graffiti, was its main selling point, and that's what ended up earning the title an MA-15 rating. Some officials weren't thrilled with the game's premise of glorifying graffiti, as it was seen as potentially promoting vandalism. The game's use of spray paint and tagging as a form of self-expression was flagged for encouraging illegal activity.
Encourages kids to surf on trains, to surf on buses, to obliterate road signs.
And the board eventually decided to refuse classification. The idea that players could use graffiti to make political statements or simply mark their territory wasn't something the censors wanted to support. Blitz The League was a brutal, over-the-top take on American football released in 2005. Developed by Midway Games, it served as a spiritual successor to the NFL Blitz games, and it promised a gritty, no-holds-barred version of the sport where players could engage in not just hard-hitting tackles, but also shady deals, performance-enhancing drugs, and of course, plenty of violent on-field action. This wasn't your typical Madden football. Blitz was more about the spectacle than realism, with bone-crushing hits and a storyline that focused on corruption and scandal in the sport. Players could injure opponents in graphic ways and use finishing moves like bone crushers to knock them out of the game. But what really caused concern was the game's portrayal of drug use and morally ambiguous characters. The use of performance-enhancing drugs wasn't just a plot point, it was a gameplay mechanic. Despite the controversy, Blitz The League managed to make its way into players' hands in the rest of the world, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in a sports game. Rimworld might seem like an odd choice for this list, given its focus on colony management rather than explicit violence. Released in 2018, the game tasks players with managing a group of survivors on a distant planet, navigating everything from resource gathering to occasional alien threats. So why did it get caught up with Australia's classification board? The game's mature themes like drug addiction, mental illness, and sexual content were the main concerns. Players can choose to engage with these elements, which include drugs like smoke leaf and yayo. While these can be turned off, they were enough for the board to initially refuse classification. The developers quickly made changes to address the issues, and after some tweaks, Rimworld was reclassified and given an MA-15+ rating in Australia. It's a strange case, especially compared to more overtly violent games, but it shows how complex video game classifications can be, even for a game that doesn't focus on violence. When Left 4 Dead 2 released in 2009, it took the world by storm. Being a sequel to the beloved Left 4 Dead, the game promised more fast-paced, action-packed gameplay with new characters, weapons, and of course, hordes of undead to mow down. However, Australia's classification board wasn't exactly thrilled with its over-the-top violence. The game was initially refused classification due to its graphic gore, specifically the level of dismemberment and blood splatter. In a game where the goal is to kill zombies in the most visceral ways possible, this wasn't exactly surprising. The fact that some weapons could cause limbs to be severed and enemies to be splattered with blood made the game a bit too intense for Australia's censors. Valve made a quick edit to the game, toning down the gore by reducing the amount of blood and violence in certain areas. This was enough to get Left 4 Dead 2 reclassified, and it was eventually released with an MA 15+ rating. South Park: The Stick of Truth was exactly what fans of the TV show expected. Crude, controversial, and unapologetically in your face. Released in 2014, this turn-based RPG let players step into the shoes of the new kid in town, joining the iconic South Park kids in a wild fantasy adventure that parodies everything from video games to pop culture. However, Australia's classification board wasn't too fond of the game's humor, specifically the explicit sexual content and offensive themes. The game features a notorious sequence where players get anal probed, along with other outlandish and inappropriate moments that push the boundaries of good taste. After some edits and a few content cuts, including replacing the alien probe scene with a picture of a crying koala bear describing what is happening to the character, The Stick of Truth was reclassified and given an MA 15+ rating for release. While the game's humor was perfect for fans of the show, it was also a perfect storm of offensive material for the Australian censors. Still, it eventually made it to Australian players, albeit in a slightly more family-friendly form. While some of these decisions make sense due to explicit violence or controversial themes, others highlight the complexities of balancing creative freedom with public concern. Whether it's over-the-top violence, sexual content, or even drug use, these bans serve as a reminder of how games can push boundaries, and sometimes get caught in the crossfire. Ultimately though, many of these titles found their way to Australian players, proving that even the most controversial games can eventually break through the censorship barrier. Also, censoring video games is dumb. Come on.